So now we come to the editor and publisher, and his name is Chris Oliveros, and in many ways he's the guy who's presided over this remarkable growth in both the critical and academic success of cartooning. Chris, welcome to ideacity.
Thanks. So I'll just sit down. I hope that's all right. These are tough acts to follow. Now, I started Drawn Quarterly almost 20 years ago, and since that time, we've published some of the best cartoonists working in graphic novels, including Chris Ware, Chester Brown, Seth, and Linda Barry. Now, it's kind of funny following both Matthew and Anne, because in many ways, it's kind of the same medium. It's comics. It's, we're dealing with pictures, with words. But of course, in other ways, it's very different. Graphic novels are actually, they're comic books. They're longer narratives. And one of the challenges that we've had for all these years is that we're actually working in a medium that was largely perceived as being something that only could be for kids. So that, because primarily comic books were intended for, children or maybe adolescents. And primarily they were, people think of them as something, Iron Man comics or the Hulk or whatever. So for anyone to actually even try to do something that wasn't that, it was always very difficult. And it was really a tough challenge in these last 2 decades to actually convince people that comics could actually be something beyond that. It's only actually recently, I would say in the last handful of years, that the term graphic novels is actually being sort of accepted and understood. So again, so this is just recent, but I'll just go back a little bit in time to sort of trace its roots. You can probably trace it back to the underground comics movement of the 1960s. And this image over here is sort of one of the iconic images of that period. This is a cover by R. Crumb, who is one of the leading and most talented figures of that movement. Now, the problem with the underground comics of the 1960s was that, like a lot of things associated with the hippie movement, the subject matter was kind of limiting. You pretty much only had you could talk about sex or drugs, and that was it. And they all kind of had a stick it to the man attitude. So there was only so much you could do with that sort of material. And also, there was really kind of one graphic style. Everybody sort of copied Crumb. Everything kind of looked the same. So it was not really surprising that it sort of just floundered by the early to mid-'70s. It is actually a little interesting, if I can just go a little bit before that period in the late 1960s, only because hearing Christy Hefner's speech yesterday, Hugh Hefner actually was a great supporter of cartoonists, and he actually supported some of the best cartoonists prior to R. Crumb. One of them was Harvey Kurtzman, and in the pages of Playboy, he actually published, again, some of the best people of that period, and he supported them, throughout many years. And I might be wrong, but I think I read somewhere that Hugh Hefner himself actually wanted to become a cartoonist. He obviously chose the better path. So after the underground comics just floundered in the 70s, it really actually seemed like the whole thing was gonna collapse and just kind of disappear. But what probably saved everything was in 1980, the cartoonist Art Spiegelman and his wife, the designer Françoise Mouly, who's now the art director of The New Yorker, they actually started their own comics anthology magazine called Raw. This was actually something they just literally started on their own. It was done in their loft in Soho. And it was this avant-garde comics magazine that published the work of people in Europe in translation and new cartoonists in North America. And it was really the first time in North America that you had anyone actually doing comics that actually took on different subject matters, again, sort of going much further than the underground comics went. and also had many different graphic approaches. You know, everything had its own look. Also, more significantly, in the pages of Raw is where Spiegelman himself had serialized his graphic novel Mouse. So it's interesting that Mouse actually was self-published originally. Of course, it was later published in book form and won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, after that period, there were a lot of cartoonists that were greatly influenced by everything that Spiegelman had done in Raw and with his book Mouse. And actually, funny enough, a lot of the best cartoonists were actually right here in Canada. John and Quarterly actually started, in 1989, and then we started publishing these other cartoonists. Chester Brown, who later became more known for his book Louis Riel, did a book called I Never Liked You. And this was a book that was a deeply personal autobiographical novel about his time growing up in a Montreal suburb. And he was doing things in this book that, again, you would never associate with a comic book. Like usually a comic book is, the Hulk smashing somebody over the head. This was a book that was very, very subtle. He was talking about things like, his first crushes with girls, teenage alienation, even the slow and gradual death of his mother. So again, it was very interesting that people were taking this medium and using it in this manner. These cartoonists were also sort of taking the old baggage that was left over from the comic books. Like, for example, I think we're all familiar with captions like "suddenly" or "meanwhile" to show as devices, as narrative devices. So you would have people like Chester who would actually have no captions at all on a page or even in an entire book, and you would have silent panels in the same way a film director would have silent scenes to actually move along a story. In other words, you didn't need to be hit over the head to be told, okay, and now Jack is putting on his coat, and now his wife is, putting on her hat. Another very major cartoonist, also still working today, is Seth, also from Canada. One of his early major books was this book called "It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken." And like Chester, Seth's early work was autobiographical in nature, although it's also interesting, like what you could do with the medium, because it was an autobiographical book, but he also introduced a lot of fictional elements. And what was interesting about a lot of these cartoonists is that each one of them had their own distinctive approach, not just to the story, but graphically as well. So I mentioned before how with the earlier comics, everybody wanted to copy Crumb, or with, let's say, mainstream superhero comics, 100 people have to copy this sort of house style. With these comics, it really showed the unique vision of the actual cartoonist. Oddly enough, Seth's aesthetic is very influenced by 1940s graphics and New Yorker cartoonists like Charles Addams and Peter Arno. So what was happening at this point is that you had, this would be, let's say, the late 90s by now, and you had a lot of this material that was, emerging and coming out. But for the most part, it actually still remained obscure. It actually was very much on the sidelines of popular culture. It actually seemed like it was never going to change. Like we just could never get beyond that wall. And there were a couple of major problems. One was that you pretty much could only find these graphic novels in specialty comic stores. And now these are the kind of stores where you would go to buy your Iron Man comic book or Star Wars trading card. At the time, let's say when somebody would ask me what I did, I would say, well, I'm a publisher of comic books, and then let's say they would say, oh, that's great, I have a son, he's got boxes of comics, he loves them, and then I would usually try to say, well, it's not really comics like that, and I try to explain, and I say, well, we're doing comics for an adult, more for an adult readership. And then when you had those two words together, comics, which is, people associate with children, and adult, all of a sudden it was like we were doing pornography. And it was very difficult to explain the nuances between the two, and to explain that actually this is a medium like, let's say like books or films or music, whatever, and it could be about anything. It doesn't have to be just limited to that one thing. I would say that the real turning point probably occurred around the year 2000, when an enormously talented cartoonist named Chris Ware had his first book published called Jimmy Corrigan, the Smartest Kid on Earth. Now, Jimmy Corrigan was a fictional work, although like the work of Chester Brown and Seth, it was actually also very deeply personal. It actually, in many ways, mirrored his own life, of how he was missing his own father, and his father wasn't in his life. And there was a number of important things that happened with this book. One of them is in England, the book won the Guardian First Novel, Best First Novel Prize, which is normally very important, but even more significant here because actually this was not a normal novel. This was a graphic novel, so it was the first time that a graphic novel had ever won, a literary prize that was normally reserved for regular books. Also, on this side of the Atlantic, the Jimmy Corrigan actually started getting a lot of coverage and praise that was usually reserved for regular fiction. So, for example, the New York Times Book Review and all sorts of other publications would write about it, and that was unusual because prior to that, these books were you pretty much would have to you could only read about them in, let's say, the Comics Journal or something, and you'd have to be sort of in the know to know that that's where you go to read reviews and so on. So that actually really changed things a lot. And now, and then after Jimmy Corrigan, a lot of, many other cartoonists started to emerge. A lot of important books started coming out. One of the important books for us, and in particular here in Canada, was Chester Brown's Louis Riel. So after Chester did his book, I Never Liked You, shortly after that, he went on to do Louis Riel, which is a biography, as Canadians here would know, of Louis Riel. And it was also important because in Canada in particular, Canada tends to be a few years behind everywhere else in the world. So that when in the U.S. people were catching on to this, in Canada they still didn't really know about it. And this was kind of the book that was needed. People said, "Oh, a comic, Louis Riel, of course," and it went on to become a bestseller in Canada. And it also really showed people that it showed people that for the first time that graphic novels could be about anything. I mean, when Mouse came out, they said, okay, it's about the Holocaust, but I think the New York Times even said that Mouse wasn't a comic book because they just couldn't understand it. So this actually showed you that you could actually do many other things. You could sort of tackle many, many different subjects. Another example would be this book that was published recently called Pyongyang. This was done by a Quebecois cartoonist named Guy Delisle, and he actually got to go to North Korea for a few months, which is very unusual. It's almost impossible to get into that country. And he started taking notes, and he actually wasn't intending to do a graphic novel on it. But of course, the country itself is so fascinating and crazy that he thought it would make an intriguing graphic novel. So again, this is sort of an example of what you can do with this medium, and that you could really do almost anything. Thanks a lot.